Hey guys, welcome to FGC University. And today we are here at Coach's Corner, of course, joined by my two goats here today, having a good time. Charles is still off doing his damn thing out in Hawaii, so shouts to Charles, man. He's always working hard. But yeah, we're out here and we're gonna have a great topic to discuss today. We're gonna dive into defense. So, Ramsey, we want to go ahead and read out the question. But right before we go to that, just as always, if you guys have any other questions, go ahead and join us here at our The Smash University Discord, and you can drop some questions as well. And feel free to like, follow, and subscribe. We appreciate it, and it allows us to connect with you all more and hear more topics that you guys want to hear, so we can discuss the things that we all want to talk about, right? But Ramses, talk to me about the question.
Yeah, so a while back we posted on Twitter essentially saying, hey, what do you guys want to hear more about? And we looked at all the requests and we've managed to discuss a few of the topics. And one that stood out to me for today is talking about defense. And so the person tweeting was talking about how defense is, at this point, a pretty confusing topic. It feels like if you defend too much, someone will just open you up. But if you don't defend at all, you're going to get mashed on. And so it feels like a catch-22 where whichever way you go, you're kind of screwed. And so I figured, hey, that's a great thing for us to discuss. I think defense is something that has changed a lot over the span of Ultimate's life throughout the metas. We saw kind of like a very reversal heavy meta early on where essentially no one knew how to hold on to aggressive advantages. And so you just kind of mashed on the opponent and broke them over repeatedly. Then we saw Leo really change things up, really revolutionize things with his control over stage, or with his focus on stage control, and essentially denying all reversals, right? Really doing a good job making sure the opponent does never get to reversal. But now we're in that late game meta, as people say, and we have Spargo reversaling, Gluttony reversaling, Light reversaling, and reversals seem to be back in the meta. And so, Tony, why don't you tell us what you think about the role of defense in the current meta and what people can do to improve their own defense?
So the way I perceive it is how it relates to the overall whole. That is to say, neutral, aggression, and defense are all kinds of on the same spectrum of what they are. Essentially, the only real modifier between these is either how your options are limited, as in you can't press the shield button and get a shield while you're in the air, for example, or it's a matter of there is a constantly floating number of you being either plus or minus in frame advantage on a given circumstance for whatever the cause. Like, for example, using the same shield example, if you're about to land, then your shield is going to be frame 5 plus whatever airtime that you're still in before you want to shield. So a normally frame 1 option is going to become frame 6, frame 8, etc., etc. And so these modifiers are constantly working, and essentially the way I've stated it as visualized is, for me, is that there's constantly a floating number over each character's head that's plus or minus a certain number that changes every single screenshot or frame of the game. And so by just playing by frame advance, this number changes, and then we add that number to our frame data for what our actual buttons are capable of. So through this context, even something like a Ganondorf dash attack can become a guaranteed thing if it becomes plus such a number to reach that frame. And so what we usually have is that what determines whether or not you're going to get a hit or such is determined based on what options you have available, and then whether that is going to be guaranteed or even just likely based on your floating frame number. So you can be plus, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're supposed to use that number if you can use that to leverage for something else, for example. So to return this back, going back to originally in Melee, this dynamic most commonly comes up based around things like crouch canceling, where even if you can get a hit in neutral, it usually your hits aren't necessarily going to be safe on a crouch cancel. So usually what you have is people will either have very reduced options that they can look for, so things like grabs and such, or usually what they'll do is they'll go for either multi-hits or some other form of very safe attack that will kind of allow them to hit you while moving back, so that whatever you're going to press from that crouch cancel is then going to not necessarily be safe to mash out. So I think the de facto level 1 here is for things like a peach to crouch cancel a down smash. And so if you're going to forward air into that and try and combo off of the forward air, let's say a chic forward air, instead of going for landing forward air to grab, you then forward air and then space it back so that if she does down smash, it will whiff, and then you can just whiff punish that grab with your forward air into grab anyways. So in this way, what normally would be your advantage is your chic forward air becomes a disadvantage based on the context of what the opponent is choosing. And so ultimately, because you're going through this flow of still guessing around your opponent's options, even though it's a little bit simpler, ultimately this is very similar to how neutral behaves in the first place. And so how we perceive that is literally just a matter of comfort. I think that the player who most exemplifies this is probably Spargo. I'm sure you've heard the expression of your honest neutral versus their dishonest mashing from disadvantage. Essentially, Spargo has a very strong intuitive understanding of how the game flows, and so you'll often see him try to initiate his own offense from you hitting him or touching him. And that's because he essentially has a framework for feeling, well, what is their actual follow-up here? And so he perceives that just because their number is plus doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to leverage that for something guaranteed. Or if they do, it's a matter of it just funnels within this, we'll call it a heat map. So for those unaware, there's essentially like a Christmas tree of things that you can access within a given amount of time. And so this is often portrayed with a heat map to relate to how easily you can access that. And so understanding this relevance and how it feels to you is its own separate skill set that usually comes with experience. And especially if you're playing on something like Wi-Fi, naturally this usually requires you to be doing things like mashing in the first place, whether you know that you can or should in the first place. And so I think that's usually where people have a negative perception of it, is just ignorantly pressing things when you get hit, and then just watching hits that should never come out in sequence, allowing you to get some of the fakest strings in your life because they're just mashing their cloud forward airs out of stun every time you touch them. And so you just keep stringing together these cheap hits, and it's really frustrating because you feel like you're not even playing the game against this person because they're just defaulting to these silly things and trying to claim advantages that they should never own in the first place. And I think that's what people typically think of mashing. However, the difference here is understanding when you should default to something like a defensive option. Defense, in this case, being classified as playing the game where your win is dictated by being able to reset to a neutral or near frame neutral advantage, or attaining a neutral or near neutral position. So the ability to do things like shield again, the ability to access your dashes, etc., etc. So typically when you're looking at those two things, because they're coming from the same position though, is the main difference between defense and offense in that context is whether you are looking to secure an advantage over the opponent directly, with offense being something that secures you an advantage over the opponent directly, whereas defense, something that just eliminates an advantage that exists somewhere. So within this context, though, these are essentially things on a spectrum. But as you get into a game cast like Ultimate, this spectrum gets a lot murkier. So going from Melee into Brawl, one of the big differences there is that the hit stun values tended to be a lot lower. And also because SDI was also increased to be probably definitely the highest that it's been in the series. You have things like multi-hits becoming a liability. You have things like a lot of attacks would just straight up not be safe on hit during their own inbuilt string. And so you would have things just essentially auto-reversal you. And so you would have to have specific starters or openers that you were looking for. And that in conjunction with the increased hitboxes relative to hurtbox size it led to you essentially being unable to really whiff things unless you were intentionally doing so. Basically the reverse of the hurt box shifting that we have in Ultimate. And so you had to be a lot more careful about which buttons you would press, because the buttons would essentially enforce themselves. They would just be so large that you couldn't help but hit the opponent if you did press that button. But just hitting your opponent with that button is not always the correct choice. And looking at it from that perspective, offense was usually something that didn't actually work. Therefore, offense usually worked as a form of defense, because you would need to use things like your forward airs within the context of you need to retreat this in order to make it safe on hit. And so it was less a matter of trying to hit your opponent and more a matter of using your defense to supplant your opponent's defense, and then maneuvering those defenses against each other, essentially, so that you both were in your own castles and putting wheels on the fort and trying to either trick or force your opponent's castle into trying to topple into yours and accept a disadvantage. And to be fair, this is what most top level Smash looks like once you get down to the nitty gritty. It's you're both putting wheels on the fort and then trying to convince the other one to try and push through your gate. Going into Smash 4, this of course led to our the most famous, which is the neutral off of two people literally standing in shield next to each other.
Do you remember when I would shield and you would shield and we would just look at the neutral? I love that image.
Yes,
so iconic.
That was kind of a lot of Smash 4 matches at high level in a nutshell. And once you got into top level, it wasn't actually that, but until you reached that point, that was just the castle analogy in action. Just literally two people in their shield watching each other. Most of the time, you would reach that point, and then somebody would usually back off rather than even try and pressure the shield, and it just wasn't worth it. So, going into Ultimate, of course, we now have it to the point where you can do things like touch someone's shield and then start your next button before it's even humanly possible for them to react to the follow-up. And so there's a lot more guessing once you start this aggression initiation. So the difference there is that there's also some very powerful defensive options or reversal options from this point. So even when you do get your hit from your jump in, sometimes that's not enough. So let's say you get something like your wolf landing forward air into a weak nair. Usually that's not going to true combo into something if you're using a rising hitbox for it. And so that leaves you with a little bit of a plus value, and then your opponent has plenty of things they can do from there. And it's a matter of whether or not you want to read or go ahead and put up your walls and guess that they'll try and act on it. So to go ahead and wrap this up so that we can get over to Ramses, because I've rambled on a bit. From that point, you want to guess does my opponent want to initiate their own aggression from my hit, or do they want to focus on their defense, with defense again being defined here as resetting to a neutral position or just getting out of there altogether. So usually using that wolf example, it's does my opponent want to air dodge away? Do they want to double jump away? Or are they going to initiate aggression? Or are they going to just pick a button that gets them down on the ground and gets them moving again? So these are different forms of defense. One of these, say, mashing an air and then fast falling it to touch the ground as fast as possible, isn't necessarily something that's going to hit your opponent, but it is going to get you to the ground as fast as possible. Whereas the double jump is going to get you out of that space as fast as possible. And so these are two extreme forms of defense that are completely different, because one of these just gets you out of there guaranteed, but the other one is not going to let you get to your neutral as fast as possible, because even if you double jump out of there, that's not a good position. That's not a spot where you can necessarily leverage into your own advantage or even play neutral from. It's just accepting a defense that people tend to be more comfortable with, because at least if you double jump out, you can still drift around, you can still use air dodges, things like that. And so people tend to do that because they're more comfortable with it. And so different players have different comfort levels, which usually leads us into a kind of incentivized structure where people have preferences, but breaking down whether these preferences are for focusing toward their next offense or for feeling in control of their destiny, essentially. And so I think that's a fine spot to lead into what Ramses is going to say here.
Oh, Okay. Well, I am going to extrapolate on what you're saying a bit because, I mean, Tony, you and I know we both think about the games in very similar ways, but I think the way we draw conclusions from the way we think about the game can be nuanced differently. And I want to introduce a little bit of my nuance on what I think is a lot of truth that Tony has just spoken. And so when I think about defense, I think the issue with the term is that it often kind of describes two different things, right? And so the first form of defense is kind of like playing neutral while focusing on moving away from the opponent, essentially. And so that would be something like a Joker trying to whiff punish you. It's a very defensive thing to do. Or a Cloud trying to wall you out with a Becker. Generally, those Beckers are going to be retreating to actually wall you out. And so a lot of defense can be neutral wise, but we can also think about defense in terms of getting out of a bad spot. And so that's where what Tony said before regarding moving the fortress really comes in, returning to neutral really comes into play. And so moving the fortress is kind of like that neutral idea where we're defending our own space, kind of playing more defensively, and then resetting to zero or resetting to neutral is more of like, okay, I'm in a bad spot. How do I get out of here, right? And so when you think about playing our neutral in a more defensive way, so in other words, using more retreats, generally we see this a lot in tournament level play because being wrong defensively is less of a big deal than being wrong offensively. And so what do I mean by that? Well, think about it this way. What is scarier, walking towards someone or walking away from someone? Very straightforward, right? When you walk away from them, it's harder for them to hit you. And so doing these defensive things when we don't have information on the opponent yet is pretty high EV, pretty high expected value, because we don't have a lot of information. And when we don't have a lot of information, we're mostly relying on essentially meta information, but also just like basic coverage and risk reward. And so at a basic level, doing something while walking away from the opponent is a very high expected value type play, or at the very least, it is a pretty low risk type play, and low risk is a great way to gather more information. And so we often see sets kind of evolve, and I'm not talking about like top level because the top level players often know each other, and so generally matches kind of start in a more explosive way. But at most other levels, or when you see players play each other that have never played each other before, we tend to see these more defensive starts, because if you're wrong defensively, at least you're moving away from the opponent. Most of the time, worst case scenario, you're giving them some space and you can play the neutral with the rest of your space. Pretty straightforward. And then from there, you extract information, and using that information, you can then start transitioning into more aggressive strategies. And it doesn't mean that like, oh, I'm doing a walling back here, they're not running into it, okay, let's rush them down. No, it's a spectrum, right? So at first you'll be playing more defensively, and then if they don't run into that defense, right? So in other words, you have to change gears. You'll use the space that has just been freed up because you know they're not running into you. And that gives you a lot of space to attack the space in between you and the opponent. And then based on that, you can start aggressing more and more, or returning to a more defensive type of play style. And so that's kind of like what I think about neutral defense, is that you start off playing more defensive because of the lower risk. We don't have information yet, and then as we get more information, we can transition into more and more offense, depending on the type of information we're getting, of course. If the opponent's running into your defense, keep defending. It's a really good option. Now, the more interesting part, and I think what the question kind of is trying to solve more than neutral, is what if you're in a bad spot? What if you whiffed a move and your opponent's dashing at you? What if you just did a normal getup and you're in the corner? How do you get out of these bad spots? And that's really where we're seeing a lot of the meta changes that were described in the tweet, where, you know, first people were very reversal heavy, then Leia was just controlling the stage and you couldn't get past him, and now people are reversing all over again. And so what I think is important here is to keep in mind, first of all, what Tony said. Your goal in most of these situations, if we're talking about essentially the most effective outcome, right, the most efficient outcome, is to reset to a neutral-ish scenario. And so why is this so important? Why are we not fighting in these situations? Well, I think there's a very nice bit of wisdom from the Art of War here. And so in the Art of War, at least in my copy, there's a very nice quote which says, offense is for times of surplus, and defense is for times of need. And so what that essentially says is that it extrapolates, and I'm going to explain to you how it extrapolates. So what it essentially tries to explain is that the offense itself, right, the degree to which you can expect success is less so based on the offense and more so based on the circumstances of the offense. And so if your army is well fed and you have the upper hand and you're fighting from the high ground and you have muskets and they have clubs, then you're going to win. And so it's not really about the offense itself, but just because of the circumstances, we just have a better shot. And I think this is very true in Smash as well. We can think about every situation as having a set of outcomes, kind of like the Christmas tree that Tony described. And so if you look at the situation in front of you and you look at all the possible outcomes and you add them up, you compare them, and you say, well, on average, these are not great outcomes, then the best thing to do is to not engage in that situation, not fight your opponent, because on average, the outcome is bad, right? So if you're in the corner, even if we're kind of ignoring the lack of options that you have from being in the corner, the outcomes on average are worse because you're closer to the blast zone, and there's more risk because you could be off stage. And so understanding how circumstance changes the average outcome of a situation can help us judge whether we should engage or not. And so what makes Smash so cool is that sometimes you don't know if you have a surplus or if you're in need. And sometimes, and this is the coolest part, sometimes you have a surplus in another way, in one way, but a need in another way. And so that's where we get to Spargo. So what Tony described is essentially what I'm going to describe in a little bit more, I think, of a with a different perspective. And when I look at Spargo, what I'm seeing is that he's saying, hey, I'm in a bad spot, right? So like just objectively, if we look at all the outcomes, these are not great odds for me. But part of what determines the expected value of a situation is the chance to succeed, right? So when you throw out an option, how likely is that option to work? And so what Spargo said is, well, I can look at that very objectively and say like, okay, well, my backer covers these options, and in the corner, I don't really have access to backer, so I cannot cover, blah, blah. But chance to succeed is not just coverage. If it was just coverage, we would enter a situation, roll some die, take the outcomes, and we would never have to play Smash. The cool part of Smash is that part of your chance to succeed is how well you read the opponent. And so Spargo says, you know what if I redirect a lot of my mental energy to figuring out what the opponent wants? And now it doesn't matter that objectively this is a bad situation, because if I know what you want, then I can turn it into a good situation. I can have a surplus in information on the opponent, even though I have a need or like a deficit in risk reward. And so what does that force you to do? Well, that forces you to keep up with him in terms of, making reads. And if you do that, then he can attack you in other ways, and we get into the whole mental stack debate that we've discussed plenty of times on this channel. And so when you're in these times of need, in other words, if you're in a disadvantageous position, there are two things that I think are important. So one, you need information, and two, you need to gather the information safely, right? And that's where you get things like rolling out, rolling in, full hopping, just holding shield, dash back, all of these types of options. And the purpose of these options, of course, at a base is just to return to a sort of neutral situation, get back into a situation in which the expected value is better for you, and go from there. But in the long term, right, at a longer time horizon, we're thinking, hey, how are they pressuring me? And can I make use of that? And Spargo does a great job using, for example, Cloud Up Smash, because not only does that cover a lot of options in a game where jumping is so powerful, it also kills. And so now he's introducing an option that you have to respect. And that's also why characters like Kazuya do so well, because he's very similar in that regard. Steve, all of these characters can really reversal with quite good reward on the table. And so what does that force you to do? It forces you to be even more passive so that you're ready for these reversals. But now that you are more passive on the offense, they get more room on the defense. And suddenly, where's your pressure? And so establishing these reversal options, establishing your preferably high coverage, high reward options when you're in a bad situation is important. But I don't recommend starting a game off doing so. You can to some degree, like if you know the player, do so. There are certain patterns in matchups, right? Like if you're playing against Little Mac, jump out of the corner, man. What's he gonna do? It's Little Mac. But outside of these general wisdoms, take a little bit of time to gather some information and then act on it. Trust yourself. Trust the information. Don't be too hasty. Of course, you don't want to say like, oh, well, they jump in Beckered me once, I'm going to read their jump. You want to have a decent amount of information, but don't overthink it, right? Don't wait for 10 of the same options before you commit. It's fine to commit out of these bad situations once you feel like you have the read. And if you're wrong, you're wrong. It's part of the game. It's good to accept that, hey, if you're going to commit to this, you're going to lose, but you're going to win too, because now you're saying, hey, you got to keep track of this reversal. You got to keep track of these options, and your opponent's offense is going to decrease in quality. And so to reiterate, I think there's two kind of like forms of defense. There's your neutral defense, which is mostly about defending your own space and creating space for you to aggress when you don't yet know what your opponent is going to do. And being wrong in that type of defense, being wrong in moving the fortress around, is a lot lower reward than running into your opponent and being wrong about that, because you're running right into their loving arms. And if it's like a Kaze or a Luigi, their loving arms are going to love that. That's a stock gone easily, right? And the other part of the defense that you got to keep in mind is how to deal with being in a disadvantageous situation. And so what you ideally want to do is find some sort of surplus in that type of situation. And that, like what I talked about, is kind of like reading your opponent, but that can also be matchup knowledge, right? So if you play, let's say, Piranha Plan, and your opponent doesn't know that you have like quite a good dash tech in terms of effective range, check them with dash tech. See if they're willing to play around this. I know Bayo players get a lot of mileage out of ABKing out of the corner. Steve players get a lot of mileage out of minecarting out of the corner. Sonic players get a lot of mileage spinning out of the corner, right? And so checking them with these more complex moves, these execution checks, is really important. But also check them with, like I said, reads. And so the more of a surplus you can find, the less of an advantage they have. And you gotta keep that margin as thin as possible. And so the more of an advantage you can reduce, the more control you have. The more control you have, the more likely you are to win, given that you're the better player. And so don't give your opponent too much respect, but also don't disrespect them too much. Really try to find that thin line. And the only way to find it is by being a little bit rude every so often and throwing out that dash check out of the corner, throwing out that jump cloud fair when you're in the corner, and see if you can get away with it. Because if you never test the limit, then there's a good chance that you're giving them more control, more respect than they really should have, and you're not playing towards the surpluses that you do have. What do you think, Bam?
Hold on, sorry. Something
You're
is
good.
Playing my ear. But yeah. Yeah. So I think on my side, I think it's a really great point that you're talking about in terms of like challenging. You gotta let, first off, you gotta let people know you're here, right? If you're just doing bot activity, like, then you gotta do whatever you want, right? And I think one of the biggest things when you are playing a game, I think especially in Smash, these kind of moments, like so I'm gonna talk about it in terms of like the offensive, right? Like the kind of minor advantage, right? We're gonna have like some frame advantage there a little bit, right? But it's not something guaranteed or whatever it may be. Like those moments are like, and identifying that defensively is like huge, right? Because it's essentially, for those who do play traditional fighters, it's essentially kind of like that is a more common experience for us versus like frame traps, right? Like actual frame traps in a traditional fighter. Like it's a very similar thing where it's like, as a player, like how you get better defensively is like you're gonna have the guaranteed stuff and whatever it may be, but like how do you navigate like frame traps? And for those who don't know frame traps in a traditional fighter, right? Essentially, it's when you essentially you press a button on someone's like a shield, right? On their block, and then they essentially have like a tensional gap there. And usually, whether it is because of the frame advantage or they have a move that like because of the spacing advantage, whatever it may be, if you press a button there, you're gonna lose, right? And that's like they intentionally make these gaps so that it's not that you're just holding block. You press the button, your quickest button, and try to do that defensively, and then you just get beat up for it, right? Again, to what Ramsey was saying and Tony was saying as well. When we come down to it, though, Smash is just so complex. Its base system is so complex, right? And because of the decay, like the Herbox shifting, being airborne, all those kind of things, you get this state that's kind of similar in way how frame traps can be, right? Where you have that like kind of minor advantage, right? But it's still like so unique, and so like you really need to be able to like you shouldn't be swinging initially first, but it's like something very important because that's really what extends a lot of people's offense, right? And it's the idea of like, hey, are you aware of in this moment, like, can you gauge how much surplus I actually have here, right? Can you gauge that kind of advantage? Because there's times where it's like, all right, yeah, someone will go ahead and say like, you say, for example, right, you get hit with like a Mithra F tilt or whatever, right? Like say you're in a space, you're not really gonna get a fair, whatever it may be. But it's like people can be in that space and they automatically are like, oh man, I wanna run away, I wanna like air dodge, I wanna do all these kind of things. And you need to be able to understand, especially as this game continues towards the end game, of like depending on the general percentages, right? Like it's gonna be hard to get the specifics, but you need to have a general idea of some of these key moves for characters, right? I think it's very important for people to take when they're looking at matchups and they're trying to take it to the next level to really understand this. I think that's where you kind of get a little bit more granular with it when you're like learning these matchups where it's like, okay, I know if I get hit by this move, it may not be a guaranteed combo, but I know generally at this percentage, based on this general usage, what opens up, right? Where they're going to have enough frame advantage to swing here and I lose, or they don't have enough frame advantage here, and if I swing, I win. And I think Spargo is so good at that because he's like, dude, like, I'm experienced. I've seen this stuff before, all right? You're not gonna catch me lacking, right? There's so many times people are like, oh, cool, I can just push this button here because they're afraid they're gonna lose. Like, no, you gotta challenge that, right? And so, yeah, I think that we saw a lot of people kind of going back to like what you were talking about in terms of history, right? Where you saw the spacing coming from Leo, right? And kind of that structured approach, and where because he played that way, it was like people like, dude, they're like, all right, I'm not gonna push a button, right? Because like I'm getting cooked, right? But then everyone started doing like, hey, let me start playing like that as well too. But you know what? Some people are kind of lying. Some people are doing stuff and it's just not real. But that's why you got to challenge them.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's happening now, where a lot of more people are just like, oh wait, that's kind of not real, and that's okay. Offensively, that's kind of okay because sometimes you got to do that too, right? Like you also got to know where their psyche is, where oh, are they afraid, or maybe it's not even afraid, are they gonna relinquish this opportunity, right? Are they not even thinking about this? Because that's a whole bunch of information for you, right, as an offensive player as well. But defensively, you really got to be able to identify these situations, these nuance, what characters, what they have in their toolkit. Like, can they even reach me here to begin with, right? Is this something where probably their best button to push with this advantage that can catch me? You know what? I got a hurt box shift that if they press that button, if I just swing here, I'm kind of good. There's not really much they can get with me unless it's going to be a hard read, right? But like identifying those kind of things is so important as you're getting to like the next stage of defense in this game, because you can't allow people to just be able to do this stuff for free, right? Because that means you might as well just give them give them the cow, give them the whole cart. Go ahead, especially how offense is getting better, right? People are just getting so much better and optimizing, and that's just indicative of a late game meta, right? People are just getting better at their combo game. They're getting better at their tech chases. Like obviously we see people in platform tech chases, right? They're optimizing things where it's like, hey, you know what? If you're on the platform and I got you, I have enough frame advantage where I can cover every option. In certain instances, I can just react to it. Get cooked. Sorry. That's it. Right? So like that's why it's even more important in those moments where it's not guaranteed that you can identify when you can swing, when you don't swing. Right? So I think for a lot of people, it's really important to sit down and look at these characters. I mean, obviously, take apart the kind of the main characters and main threats that you're probably going to deal with when you're going through a bracket, but really start to look at like, okay, what's the frame advantage these characters are getting here? What are the actual options they have here? And what are my counter options? What is usually successful if I do swing? Right? Obviously, when you swing, you want to swing with a button that actually makes sense. You don't want to do some super like, hey, let me do this like 40 frame move out of this disadvantage. Like
Bowser forward smash out of the corner.
Like, that's not gonna do anything, right?
Nah.
But like, once you actually go through that data, it'll take you so far. Because I think still to this day, even though we're late in the meta, I think there's not enough people doing work on that. Just because it's not as glamorous, right? It's just not as glamorous as a cool combo and this whatever. But I'm telling you right now, that can change the whole trajectory of a match, right? Because now what is required from your opponent is, going back to the offense, like we were talking about Ramses, right? Now I need the whole surplus. Now I need the high ground. Now I need everyone well rested because I can't attack this castle otherwise. I'm getting cooked. They got the melt. They got everything. I can't
The
just go
throwing,
off and do
burning
whatever I
oil,
need to do.
brother. I
Yeah.
don't
They
want to
got
go
it,
out like
man.
this.
Exactly. I can't go there. I can't just run in there with a little surplus, right? It's because that's what a lot of times, like when you see someone who's really good at offense, and again, it's not just in Smash, it's in traditional fighters as well. A lot of people who are really good at offense, they find ways, right? And they break down like, oh, like let me test your defense. Oh, you don't know this. You don't know that. Like I have. Let me take a little more. Right? It's like, oh yeah, technically I should only get this, but oh you're not even prepared for it. So I'm gonna take a little more. I'm gonna take a little more. Right? And you have to play with that, but that requires you to have a understanding of those complex situations, right? And really know what's happening there. And then you can choose to either, hey, you know what? I'm gonna be a little greedy right now, or I'm gonna be conservative. I get enough from this situation. I can step back and go from there. But if you don't know the rules of the game, then you're cooked. It doesn't matter, right? And it's understand it's not just swinging just to swing. There is a deeper layer to it, and as complex as Smash can be, there's general tenets that you can abide by, general understands you can abide by, right? Like I really love going through and being like, okay, these certain characters, this is a really good poke for them. And again, it's people are now offensively because it's a good poke. It may not be the best combo starter, but it's a good poke, and they know how to translate that into getting some string or something going on, right? So it's like I need to look at those moves and be like, okay, so that great poke, what happens if they hit me with it like 3 times, right? Is it decayed enough to the point where it's not giving them that advantage to do those kind of things? Like that information is gold. It is gold, and it's like again, most people just aren't going to take the time and due diligence to sit down and do that. But like that can really change the trajectory of how you approach a matchup. Because it's like, okay, I can afford to get hit by that now right now. Like that's cool. Like, oh, I got hit by that. Like, I'll pick that. It's not even poison anymore. It's just water. I'm drinking it. Cool, thanks. You know what I mean? Because I know instead of me freaking out and be like, oh gosh, I got hit by this move. Like, let me jump off into a cliff or an abyss, and then they get everything they wanted, right? So, I think that going back to it, like when someone is trying to be better at defense, especially in this stage of the game, identifying those moments are really, really impactful and will greatly improve your defense. So.
Another way of looking at this topic is essentially within the critical thinking question of whose game is it anyways? Mm-hmm. And so
is that a critical thinking question, Tony?
Oh yeah. So
I
well,
saw that on TV.
I think Smash. Then whose game are we playing?
Yeah.
And so you'll have things like obviously Diddy Kong is a front runner for like a character that generally like when you start the game and Diddy's always going to get a banana before you can interact. And then from that point on, we're playing the Diddy show, except not in every matchup. And so what are some of Diddy's worst matchups? They're the ones where we're playing the duck hunt game now. And so what really puts Diddy on the back foot from the start is the fact that even if Diddy does get something started, generally what happens is the opponent's going to be able to defend against that and kind of force the game to be in a different context. And so this kind of shifts the perspective of what offense and defense really are as a matter of leveraging control over the very nature of the game. And then obviously this is also represented well in games like Rivals of Aether, where you're literally fighting each other for creating the stage that you're going to be fighting on in the first place. So within this context, it still fits within the framework of having a neutral offense or defense, because presumably when it's neutral, nobody's playing any game, and we're all playing Ultimate, whatever that means. But ultimately, these words are pretty meaningless until we actually can attach that concept to it. So within that context, we then, again, want to think about, well, what can I do to subvert my opponent's game so that we're not playing their game? So this doesn't necessarily mean we're playing your game either, but going back to the Diddy Kong and Duck Hunt example, this might reflect itself in maybe we're using our time with Banana to just act as pressure so that Duck Hunt isn't trying to rush us down to keep us from getting Banana. But really what we're just playing to do is just to put Can out of position so that we can play what is a relatively neutral game beforehand, just so that we're not playing the Duck Hunt game anymore. Or perhaps if we're feeling particularly pressured by the duck hunt side B where they throw the discus. I'm forgetting the name of it.
Clay pigeon?
Yes, thank you. If we're just getting frustrated by clay pigeon, then using something like tossing banana over can, just so that it's pressuring duck hunt in a way so that there's still plenty of things duck hunt can't do, but duck hunt can't play with clay pigeon. And so even though it's not really allowing us to start up our own offense or our own aggressive pressure, it's still pressuring the opponent in a way that prevents them from playing a part of their game that we don't want to play. And so this enables us to, again, hybridize that sort of offense and defensive as a way of just forcing the game to play differently. And so going back to Spargo, if Spargo wants to force the game into being a context of being spacing and timing, rather and a matter of positioning your hitboxes and versus your hurt box, which is usually what most players would consider to be things like traditional Smash. If that is the pseudo game that Spargo wants to enforce, he can do this in a way that isn't necessarily forcing his game plan onto the opponent. Like you can just walk away and there's nothing he can do about it. But by playing the way he does from the back foot, it prevents you from being able to feel like he's on the back foot in the first place, because it's still a matter of the ebb and flow, the actual tempo of the match is within that specific context of the game. And so I'm going to go ahead and quote Lima on this when discussing Spargo is, no matter what I hit him with, he's still trying to kill me. And so the context here, though, is that even when he is mechanically in a defensive position, mentally he is not on the defense. And so, like, this is a different form of defense. It's a matter of, well, how can I force my game on the opponent even when the game is out of my control on a physical level? And so if you can maintain that, it still limits what kind of game your opponent can play. If their whole game plan is to put you into a little bucket so that they can kind of control what you're doing from there, no matter what you do, even if you're lying on the floor, just don't get in the bucket. Don't sit on that chair. Just do anything else, so that you're not put in that little position where the opponent's going to be more comfortable with you. So within that context, there's obviously a variety of different ways we can look at this, from, say, something like Snake enforcing his grenade neutral loops to being able to disrupt that with just having something like a Fox laser or a Falco laser, because just being able to disrupt that tempo is not enough to actually establish any form of offense, but it's still a way of defending yourself from their game plan in a way, just because preventing them from mounting their offense in the first place is that form of defense. And so that's just another perspective to share with that. Ramses, do you have another one?
I have two things I want to bring up as kind of like closing thoughts for me. I think what Bam said is so accurate about kind of like dissecting the opponent's offense, and from the holes in that, kind of launching your defense or counter offense, as Tony describes it. And I think what people are missing is the intuition, because it's very counterintuitive to fight when you feel that you're weaker, right? And so what you need to do if you want to build that is build your intuition. And that's where I really recommend, as Bam said, to review your VOD and go into these situations in which you feel like you're on the back foot, pause, and analyze where the openings are. So when we think about intuition, I think there's a right way to build intuition and a wrong way to build intuition, which is, I mean, not like a scientific, this is my take, right? So I think a lot of people build intuition by just playing the game a lot and essentially absorbing information through osmosis. It's like I play a million games and then I eventually know the rules. True. The thing is, most good players are pushing the boundaries of the game. They are going into extremes. And so your 1 million games worth of data suck ass versus good players. Just straight up, they're betraying you. And so when we think about intuition, how do we build good intuition? Good intuition approximates an ideal. It approximates something that you can only figure out through analysis, right? And so what we need to have good intuition is something to model it after. And so we gotta first, pause the screening review, look at why their offense sucks, think about the context in which they are setting up their offense, right? So maybe you're in the corner. Okay, let's think about corner pressure. Okay, are they rushing me down? Are they taking the time to set up a jump? Are they waiting for me to reversal, right? Just think about the full context and then try to train yourself to recognize that in the moment and then try to approximate the type of choices that you would make in VOD review. And so that's what intuition is. Intuition is an approximation of an ideal. Well, if it's good intuition, right? If it's bad intuition, it's just, again, it's just osmosis of a million games. The million games are still good because they're going to tell you kind of like where you're starting from, right? They're going to give you direction. It's like north, east, southwest. Very important to know. But sometimes someone tends to go north and then they suddenly go back south. And you don't know how to interpret that because your intuition is north, east, southwest. Where's the nuance? And so that's where analysis can really be useful because, again, it helps you understand these extremes. It helps you understand the nuances. And so I will never claim that theory is good in the moment, right? I don't think anything that is worth really diving into in your free time is worth trying to apply in real time in a match. It's probably too complex. If you're thinking about a situation properly, you are including so many variables, it is not humanly possible to think this way in a match if you're trying to play at any sort of speed. Trust me, I tried. Tony, did I try?
A little bit.
I tried, dude. I tried really hard to play with my brain at like 110%. And my conclusion was I can't, right? Tony told me you should think like a cluster of neurons, right? I should role play just like a bunch of nerves. And I think there's a lot of truth, especially as the meta has been progressing. I mean, I've been retired for like 2 years now, so my experience is, like my slower playstyle worked back then. Nowadays, it would not do shit, right? And I mean, I've changed my playstyle too. But point is, recenter. You got to play fast to keep up nowadays. And so the faster you play, the less time you have to think about these really complex ideas. And also, because people develop their play, you need more complexity to actually keep up with people. Because again, the more factors you include in your decision making, the more accurate your decision is going to be, right? And so what we need to do is identify this ideal and then approximate it in our intuition, right? We got to apply heuristics. If my opponent's in the corner, I'm going to corner pressure. Is that always true? Probably not. There's probably some exceptions, right? Pac-Man with Galaga in his hand, you probably don't want to pressure him too much. But it's a great rule to start from. And so these approximations are extremely doable. They're extremely executable in the moment, but approximations are only as good as the ideal that they are modeled after. And so that's what I really recommend you guys to do if you want to build your intuition, is to model it after something. And then when your intuition sucks, when it's wrong, you actually know that there's an issue with your model, or you haven't implemented it properly. But now that you know there's an issue in your model, you can actually learn something from it. If you're working with a million games of osmosis and something goes wrong, you're like, oh, that should have worked. That's weird. And then you move on, right? And so I really, really recommend modeling your intuition after something. The other thing that I think is important to say is that shielding makes people really, really, really lazy. Just like my cameras, apparently. Shielding makes people really lazy because in most situations you can shield. It's frame one. It's pretty hard to break a shield open in this game, all things considered. They regenerate pretty quickly. And even though like shielding does sacrifice a lot of control, again, you're not getting hit, and people kind of focus on that. It's like, oh, bad situation, I shield, I'm not getting hit. Great, I love that. Let me keep shielding. But the best players control every situation they can as much as they can. And so the better thing to do is to move in some sort of way. And so I have a very quick heuristic for my students for this. If you're in a bad spot, mix between dash back, right? So with something dash back, roll in, or full hop. And so like this game is 2-dimensional, so there's forward, backwards, upwards. We have all three of them covered. All three of them require pretty significant commitment to beat, right? If you want to beat a roll in, you got to wait for it. If you want to call it a full hop, you're probably waiting in a more specific position, or you're chasing it down. And if you're calling out a dash back, that's especially committal, right? So dash back generally the best one, but roll in and full hop are good for other reasons. Mix between these three as a start. And so you'll keep control over the situation. You'll make it hard for your opponent to hit you. You're still defending, right? Because you're not trying to aggress on them. You're picking something to move away from them or move away from the position in which you missed. And nuance from there. Oh, they're dash attacking me a lot and they're catching like my dashback startup. Okay, now I can start shielding and use it more as like a quote unquote morph counter, right? I think you're gonna swing, so I'm gonna counter the swing. Or they're reading my full hop. Okay, that means that I can just kind of like stay on the ground, wait for them to read it, and then hit them for it. And so try to shield less, and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't shield at all. What I'm trying to tell you is that shield is a very lazy option because it's so good at not getting you hit. But again,
It's a one
Directly.
aspect of defense.
directly, yeah, both of you are correct, exactly. But you oftentimes, as Tony just said, people don't see how shielding messes you up in the long term. It's not about the shield and the hit you avoid it. It's about all the advantage that you could have had that you're not capitalizing on. And so be a little bit less lazy about shield. That doesn't mean use shield less. It means be more, how do I say this? Critiquing, be more reflective, be more critical. Critical, there you go. Be more critical about your own shield usage. I think that's really, really beneficial. Anything you want to add, Bam? I'm sorry, I should have thrown it over to you.
No, you're good. I was waiting for it, and I was like, okay.
My commentator funnies were not coming
No,
through.
no softballs here.
Oh man. But yeah, man. I think you're absolutely right, Ramsey. Just like the idea of like being critical of when you're shielding, understand other aspects of defense, and I think that especially when you are getting to that next level of any fighting game, right? You have to look beyond the standard like grab, attack, shield, right? Like you need to like that, like you need to look at like what's the in between, right? Like what are those things there? Because that's usually where people find growth. That's usually where people find the next stage of the meta. You know how they evolve things, and so being able to identify those things and then being able to enact on it is massive, right? And then I think the last thing that I'll just say too is that again, I know for people it is not as glamorous, but I will tell you right now, if you are looking to improve and be better, right? We all know that the saying like defense wins championships, right? We all know like the stability there, and like being able to like everyone wants to be like, yeah, we're both our hearts are on the line and all the surplus, and we're just fighting, and they love to romanticize all these kind of things, right? It's like, nah, man. Like you gotta like if you are able to take that, like when someone feels like they have all the tools and they're helpless against you, that is godlike, right? Like when you are able to do that and you are fortunate, it's like, dude, no matter how many times I hit them, I can't do it. No matter this, like they're always like, and that's so taxing because especially how most people are, they will like you're talked about being lazy in terms of shield. People also are lazy on offense, right? Like, it's like, okay, this is my tried and true. I've practiced this. I'm just gonna throw this out, cool, right? But when you have someone who's actually thinking about some of these things, and now you're actually challenging them in these certain spots, oh man, I mean, the amount of mental that like shifts when people are in those situations. Oh, it hits like, and sometimes that just breaks people straight up, dude. When someone's like, "Oh, should be my standard offensive thing," but oh, that's not real. Dude, that like like a lot of people that throws them for a loop. You can sometimes just win games off that alone, right? Just because you've identified those things, because that to them should be their glory time. That's the time in which they're they should be taking and seizing control, blah blah blah. And Nelson's like, no, actually, you don't have control. That's not real. And like being able to challenge people there, most people, like obviously as people get better and get to the next level, they're going to have more counter strategies and they're going to adapt quickly. But even for some of the highest of players, man, seeing someone who knows those kind of nuances and looking at that challenge is massive. That makes people have to sit up in their chair. That makes them have to think about things they usually don't think about, right? And that's taxing and that's tiring. And if you already know that kind of information and you can play that game already, that puts you already in an advantage, right? So it's really important to look at those things in that aspect and just not be so black and white about it. Just because I'm advantaged and I'm disadvantaged at the end, right? And just like step back and call it a day. No, like you got to see where you can move from there, right? Just the same if someone's playing basketball and you're defending someone, it's not just me being like, okay, let me just put my hands up, Sometimes I see they're moving and they're trying to do some dribbles, right? And they think they got handles, and next thing I'm like, wait, actually, that offense isn't real. I'm stealing the ball. I'm taking it. I'm going, right? And like now I'm able to create my offense. But like now that makes people think second guess how they're going to dribble. That's second guess how they're going to do the offense, right? Like what are they doing after these pokes here? Maybe I got to wait because I thought this stuff was good, but they know when it's not good or whatever. Like they're actually showing me different options here. And then all of a sudden they start cutting the offense short because they don't know what they're doing there, right? So those things go a long way, and it allows you to get to the next level, right? But yeah, a defense is nuanced. Just the same as offense can be nuanced. It's not just shield.com, right? So go learn it, figure it out, identify things, like start thinking about matchups in this aspect too, where it's like, okay, it's not just me being like, hey, I'm safe. How am I preventing them, like Tony was saying, how am I preventing them from even mounting their offense, right? Because that's a big form of defense too. How am I able to like distinguish what is real offense versus kind of pseudo offense, them trying to be greedy on offense versus not being greedy, right? Because that not only lets you kind of curtail some of this like fake offense, but also it allows you to identify kind of what their thoughts are at the time and what they're kind of focused on, what they're trying to do. And that's, being able to distinguish those things is some of the greatest information you can have when you're competing against anyone in any kind of competition, any kind of battle, right? But yeah, I think that about wraps it up here for Coach's Corner. Again, hope you all enjoyed. Please go ahead and check us out. Join the Discord, give us some more questions, hit us up on Twitter. Let us know what you guys want to hear about next. I know a lot of people, as this game is approaching the end game, people are getting, have anticipation for a new Smash and everything like that. And some people are using this time period to level up now because they understand that, hey, if you're getting better at like Smash and fighting games in general, there's going to be transferable skills, right? So we definitely in this time as well kind of ramp up, and you're trying to see how you can get yourself in a prime position to be better for the next game and stuff like that. Hit us up, ask questions, man. We love to deep dive into these things on a fundamental level. So, anyways, hope you all enjoyed. Talk to y'all soon. Class dismissed.
Hoggy woggy.
Hoggy woggy indeed.